Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston-Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. In our country, we experience a kind of yin and yang, a best of times, worst of times situation. On any given day in our society, there is some indication or event that celebrates the diversity that exists. In fact, this country, in part, has been built on being diverse. We laud the celebration of differences as a strength of this country, and we fight for the right to express these differences. This is indeed the best of times, the best of us, the yin. Of course, not all of our actions are positive. While we do recognize that differences do exist, there are those who see these differences as opportunities to belittle and bully others. The worst of times, the worst of us, the yang. Bullying is as old as society, and people are bullied for just about any characteristic. In fact, according to a recent government survey, 1 out of every 5 students reports being bullied. The characteristic that seems to be targeted the most is disability, and children can be especially cruel about it. When they are faced with a situation they do not understand or someone who does not act in the way they are used to, it often results in some negative reaction, and the person with the disability, a condition they have no control over, becomes the unfortunate victim. We all know the problems that bullying causes, from absenteeism to poor academics, to low self-esteem, and even suicide. Today, we will discuss some of these problems, then focus on potential solutions as we try to become more empathetic. Today, we welcome Kayla Taylor, author of the book Canaries Among Us, a mother's quest to honor her child's individuality in a culture determined to negate it. In this book, Ms. Taylor reveals her personal journey to get support for her neurodiverse child and the roadblocks experienced along the way, as well as what families can do to get the support they need. Kayla Taylor, welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Kevin, thank you so much for having me.
I think I know why the book is called Canaries Among Us, but you tell us why you chose that particular title.
Sure. So early in my family's journey, I realized my child is highly sensitive. It's a trait studied by several scientists like Elaine Aron. And highly sensitive people are shown to be more in tune with their environments and more deeply aware of sensory stimuli like smell, touch, all of it. And there are a lot of great benefits to this. A common analogy is the canary in the coal mine. So not too long ago, I think up until the end of the 1900s, there were mines and miners who would take canaries down into the coal mine with them, not just because they had this beautiful song that would keep them company, but also because canaries are highly sensitive to toxins. So when the canaries stopped singing, the miners knew that they probably needed to flee the mine pretty quickly, or they would be subject to carbon monoxide poisoning, which can be lethal. So I love this analogy because it shows the great benefits of being highly sensitive. Unfortunately, today in our current society, as I'm sure you're aware, sensitivity is often frowned upon. You know, people who are sensitive and are considered weak or emotional or even somewhat pathetic. But as like this analogy of the canary shows, there's actually huge benefit, not just to the individual, or in this case, the creature that has the high sensitivity, but to those around the canary or the person, if they at least appreciate it. And as I continued my writing, this idea of the canary morphed for me in my mind from talking about kids with high sensitivity to really talking about any child with any sort of learning difference, the neurodiverse. So another example would be a kid with dyslexia. Yes, kids with dyslexia are known to have a harder time reading. They have this wider visual perception mode, which can make reading harder. But studies also show that they, on average, tend to be more creative. They connect dots between disparate ideas in ways others hadn't considered. They have high reasoning. Some of the most fascinating people in our history were dyslexic, were believed to be dyslexic. Tests for dyslexia are more current, so neuropsychologists are using what they know now to posthumously diagnose people or ascertain who was most likely dyslexic. And names on the list include people like Louis Pasteur, Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, and more currently, Steven Spielberg or Walt Disney. People like Charles Schwab and John Chambers speak pretty liberally about their dyslexia, and yes, how it makes it hard for them to read, but also the many benefits that help them lead huge, great companies. It's believed dyslexia might be overweighted in the U.S. presidential population, with 8 of the 46 presidents, likely being dyslexic. So I like this analogy because I think all of our society would benefit if we didn't just pathologize people or look to their weaknesses, but if we looked at the full child, the full person, and appreciated everything about them, which most often, I would actually venture to say 100% of the time, includes some beautiful traits that can be included in humanity.
And I think what you just touched on as far as how we tend to look at the whole child, and that's usually the mantra of our educational system. How do we educate the whole child? One of those areas that we tend to forget about or leave out is the neurodiverse, or the disabilities that the children may have. We tend to say, we want to educate the whole child except for these pieces, because we don't really do a really good job in doing that. And I think that's one of the things that you came across personally. And I'm sure a lot of our parents who are listening out there have also been dealt with the schools that they are dealing with right now. So what are some of the shortcomings that you have witnessed and experienced when it comes to schools supplying the resources necessary to properly deal with children who may have some type of disability?
Right. First, I'd like to say that I actually believe most people have the best of intentions. Right, people don't go into the teaching profession for the money, for sure. Right, they go because they want to help children. I would say same with administrators and teachers and parents. Everybody wants to do their best. I think where we fail is that we just have a lack of understanding of this idea that yes, there are learning differences, but they aren't all bad, and accommodating them isn't a bad thing for our schools and our communities. It actually is a benefit to everybody. The problem, I think, is based on the fact that we aren't equipping our schools with the tools and understandings they need. There's this amazing report that actually, if I could give a copy to everybody involved in education, I would. It's called Forward Together, and it was produced by an organization called Understood and NCLD, and they surveyed teachers, and they found that only 17% of teachers feel very well prepared to teach students with mild to moderate learning differences. And as a result, they feel overwhelmed and unsupported in the classrooms. I actually did my own study, and it was just me behind a computer, but I went to a lot of the leading graduate schools of education and found concurrent information. You can graduate from some of the most highly lauded programs in America and not take one class that talks about learning differences. And I've been told that state accreditation processes are the same. They don't have much information on learning differences. I also read that, to go into a special education classroom, you would actually only need to take one class in some states in order to be credentialed. So unfortunately, there's just a lack of information. And as you know, that often leads to judgment. So 1 in 3 teachers, and likely parents too, believe learning differences or attention issues are a sign of laziness. So instead of understanding it could be the environment or the curriculum that we could adjust to support these children, all of a sudden at a very young age we're blaming the child. 1 in 4 believe learning differences can be outgrown. So instead of using research that we've had for decades, we just leave the kids behind and don't really do much, hoping they'll catch up. And 1 in 4 believe like ADD and ADHD is a result of bad parenting. So not only are the children judged, but the parents are judged as well. And as I said, the teachers feel overwhelmed. So nobody's really winning in this situation with the lack of understanding.
And I think, and it's that lack of understanding that gets transferred to students, because if the adults have this lack of understanding and therefore aren't able to really provide the resources that, or even the strategies that the students need, their students' peers are certainly going to have a lack of understanding as well. And as I mentioned earlier, they deal with it, or they express that lack in ways that are often very, very detrimental to those students who are suffering, and which makes them suffer even more.
Exactly. So studies show that nearly half, around 45% of kids with learning differences report being bullied each year. And so you can imagine what that does to someone's psyche. As I mentioned, teachers often misunderstand the children. So the children start internalizing what they see around them, what their environment tells them, that they're lazy and they're stupid and they're not worthy of being part of the community. And all this leads to increased mental health issues. So 29% of kids diagnosed with a learning difference also has an anxiety disorder. And there's a higher incidence of substance abuse, delinquency, and school dropout. What's interesting is it doesn't just end there, right? This is a lifelong thing. So there are kids with learning differences also report later in life higher rates of unemployment. But what really got me were some astonishing statistics around crime and incarceration. So 55% of kids with learning differences experience the criminal system within 8 years of high school. And I should probably stop here to say kids with learning differences, if a child gets a diagnosis, by definition, they aren't stupid. These are smart kids, and who the definition says they are more capable than their classroom performance demonstrates. So the problem is not the child. The problem is that the environment doesn't allow them to retain and express and show their mastery of knowledge. But again, the problem is not the child. But unfortunately, there isn't a path for them in the school. So at a pretty young age, they're in touch with the criminal system. 43% of juveniles, delinquents, have an identified learning difference that very arguably was just not addressed properly in the first place. And again, this continues later in life. So, as you know, society doesn't study things and it doesn't value it. And there have not been enough studies and research into this area. But there have been a few studies in the prison system, one in 2000 in Texas and more recently in 2018 in Louisiana. And both of those studies found that half of the prisoners have dyslexia, which, by the way, is just one form of learning differences. So you could imagine what happens when more ways of learning are piled on top of that. And when I was doing this research, I couldn't help but realize, oh my gosh, are we essentially criminalizing learning differences? Which to me was just a devastating notion.
You are listening to Instruction Discussion on the Voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston-Hill, and our guest today is Kayla Taylor, author of the book Canaries Among Us. You know, it's interesting that you make that particular connection, because for years we've been talking about the school to prison pipeline and how there are certain indicators that prison systems use to know exactly how many jail cells they're going to need to build it for the future and so forth. But as you mentioned, though, we don't really focus on the mental health aspect of things. We don't focus on reversing those academic trends that are those indicators they use. What are some of the resources and some of the strategies that you have come across in your journey, in your frustrations, to help you support your child?
I think one of the main things is this mind shift, and we hear about it, the whole child leaning into the strengths. But when you look day to day, are we really appreciating and celebrating differences? There's a lot of talk about tolerance, but do we really just want to be tolerating one another, or do we want to be celebrating one another? And, I had my own aha moment, so I'll out myself as, an unproud moment. But, there have been moments in my life where I have referred to people as strange or weird. When I look back on my own educational career, I hope I didn't bully anybody. But I definitely remember the kids that were thought of as weird and strange, and I say those in quotes. And looking back, I so wish I had reached out to them more and stood up for them and befriended them more, been a better bystander. So I think a lot of it is just philosophical. We know bullying is bad. We know bias is bad. But I don't think we recognize in the moment when it's happening, so that we can change our course of action or, stand up for others, even if we're not doing anything wrong, to stand up for others who need our support.
It's interesting you use the term bystander, because I know in today's parlance, when we talk about bullying, they actually want people to be upstanders, people who are going to stand up for those people that you just described and so forth. Not to say that you used the wrong term or anything, but just to see how we've actually started to evolve to provide support for people who actually do need it in our society. But I want to get into your book for a moment, because I think one of the chapters in the book, which I believe is the shortest one, is only like 2 pages or so, is titled "I See You." Now, and I think that chapter with that title is probably, even though it's the shortest, is probably the most poignant. So wow, okay. What do you see as the importance of that particular chapter in that phrase?
Right. So I, at this stage in the journey, had done a lot of research, had come to understand my child as being highly sensitive. And we were in an ice cream store, and I saw another mother who was just depleted, with 3 kids, but one clearly occupying a lot more of her energy and time than the others. And so I reached out to her and basically acknowledged her as being a good parent and, expressing joy towards her child, and just trying to convey that there was no judgment here, because I had been very familiar with that judgment, and I have many friends who said, I used to be that friend who judged other women in the grocery store line until I had my 3rd child, and oh boy, that one threw me for a loop, and now I'm not quite so arrogant. So, I think seeing other people for who they are and reaching out to them and lending a hand is really important. I talk a little bit about, there's a whole chapter on empathy and compassion. And
yes, I saw that, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but I saw that chapter as well, and I think the chapter is titled "Empathy Warrior," and I wanted to know, what does it take to be an empathy warrior? Right.
So I had thought a lot about this. In my past, I thought there are a lot of things, and we can get into that. But I think one overarching idea, again, in terms of my own learning, is I had always assumed, when I saw someone walking down the street, I saw them. And when they started speaking, I heard them. And then I would take what they had to say and decide if I agreed with it. And if I agreed with it, then I believed them. And what empathy training taught me is that is just really arrogant and highly backward. Mm-hmm. So, if I'm lucky, someone around me will share something really private and poignant and personal to them. So I can hear them. And at this point, I do have the opportunity to judge, but I also have the opportunity to put myself in their shoes and try and understand where they're coming from. And, they say walk a mile in their shoes. And that process most often causes me to believe them, to understand their story. And only when I do that can I truly see them. So I think that's a link back to the chapter about I See You. I think right now there's so much, we see it in all realms, whether it's business or politics or anything. There's so much rush to judgment. And I found it, and I talk about it, how there's so much rush to judgment even with other people's personal truths. So, I would try and tell people my child was bullied, and people who weren't even there would say, oh, no, they weren't. I'm sure you're just being too sensitive, and the child's being too sensitive, right? They just need to toughen up and toe the line. And it was so debilitating. And what was most frustrating is they weren't even there. And so I realized, I have done this too, but if we can shift our frame of view to be more empathic, to really believe, to value, to work to understand where other people are coming from, then there can be so much more compassion in our society.
And, I think you're absolutely right. And I think some of the issues that your book touches on, even though the focus seems to be more on like the pediatric bullying and things of that nature, we can really extrapolate this into a lot more of the conditions that children are faced with, not just dyslexia, not just being neurotypical or neurodiverse rather, but also getting into things like having a Tourette syndrome and tics and how, again, that's really misunderstood. I think we are, as a society, we are just now really beginning to understand autism to a certain degree. In the many stages of it. And I firmly believe that all of us lies on that spectrum at some place. Being an educator myself and being exposed to that, I believe that everybody really lies somewhere on the autism spectrum, whether they want to believe it or not. And just because of how they react. So I think we need to, and you address this in the book as well, I think you have a chapter dedicated to it, is how do we educate the educated on these different roles and different conditions that exist?
Mm-hmm. I found I think, we were focusing on empathy right now. One of the most important things to understand is our neural wiring. So our amygdala, our fear center in our brain, the one that does fight or flight or flee, gets activated within about 50 milliseconds. And it can react to racial differences, gender differences, social status, many sort of differences. All of those differences are noticed, within under 150 milliseconds. So our amygdala is already fired, right, ready to be scared and react. Meanwhile, our prefrontal cortex, our rational thinking part of our brain, only engages at 500 milliseconds. So we have perceived a difference and reacted to it in our mind before we've even really thought or realized we've done that. And I think if we don't realize that neural wiring happens, then we can't counterbalance it with intention, right? So I think that's a huge part of empathy, is just understanding how we work. And you are not necessarily a bad person if you had this initial reaction. That might have been thousands of years in development, throughout history, learning to be scared of certain things. But we now know better. So for example, they talk about how fear was great, in the hunter-gatherer society, right? So people who were highly sensitive were able to smell things in the air, so they were more likely to know if a tiger was nearby, and they could help keep the clan safe. But also people might notice threats of other invasive clans coming by who were dangerous, right, aggressive. So before we even realize it, might be noticing different things about different humans that over evolution we have been, we instinctually react to, but that are useless today, right? And so, we don't want to be reacting to skin color, for example, or other things. We're all humans. I mean, our DNA is 99.5% the same. We are all in this together. But if we understand that our brain is doing that, then we can counterbalance it to make sure that our biases remain in check so we can be more the person we want to be.
And I think that the whole purpose of the diversity training, bias and diversity training that takes place now within schools and corporations and pretty much all over deals with that very issue that you talk about, that, yes, we all have inherent biases. Now it's just a matter of how do we deal with it? Because having a bias is not necessarily bad. Doesn't mean that you're a bad person because you favor one thing over another. That doesn't make you a bad person. But in certain situations, you just want to become aware of those biases so that you can react appropriately to them and like you said, think logically about it. So it's a matter of kind of withholding that judgment, that initial snap judgment, so that you can really start to think more logically and really analyze the situation for what it is.
Right.
Again, what would you tell other, parents in a similar situation who are just at their wits' end, very similar to that mother that you saw in the ice cream shop? What would you tell parents as far as what they can do to gain more support for their children who may have any type of learning disability or even a physical one, that they're just at their wits' end and don't know where to turn next?
Right. Well, unfortunately, I think right now understanding is the best option. There are all sorts of organizations that will help you remediate and address your child's weakness. And, if something's holding back your child, I definitely, encourage getting help. I think a lot of it is a frame of mind. So, for example, I now refer to my kids' differences as differences. I don't refer to my kids' differences as disabilities. Yes, they have weaknesses that need to be addressed. And, there's an interesting concept called the social model of disability. And that is that there are some disabilities that no matter what environment you are in, they will hold you back. And, a diagnosis at that point is helpful, right? And then getting medical treatment is helpful. But there are some things we diagnose right now that really only are problematic in certain environments. So, for example, a child with ADHD, right? There have been many successful people in the world with ADHD. The founder of Kinko's, the founder of JetBlue, the founder of IKEA. We have some amazing athletes like Simone Biles, Justin Bieber. There have been some amazing people with ADHD who have done amazing things. But when we put these children in rigid environments, tell them to sit in hard chairs, have them look at chalkboards or whiteboards for extended periods of time, we are not getting the best out of that child. But I would hesitate before labeling that child as disabled. I might first try and adjust the environment to, help bring out that child's strengths. And yes, in life it will be helpful to learn to have impulse control and to sit in a chair and all of that. But I think just in terms of common understanding and compassionate and, I guess for lack of a better word, tolerance, I want to celebrate rather than tolerate. I like the idea of referring at least your own children's differences as differences, not disabilities. But that doesn't mean there's no place for understanding what your child's specific needs are. I mean, I myself had my children tested, with neuropsychologists, so I could understand specifically how their brains work, so I could lean into those strengths and support them in the ways that they need support. But again, a lot of this just comes back to philosophy and how we regard the children so that they don't assume they're less than.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think that one of the things we need to remember is not every child is a level 3 or 4 in English or in math. They are a level 3 or 4 at something, and it's up to our educational system to find out what that something is. But we would definitely like to thank our guest today, author of the book, Canaries Among Us, A Mother's Quest to Honor Her Child's Individuality in a Culture Determined to Negate It, Ms. Kayla Taylor, for coming on to our show today.
Kevin, thank you so much for your time and for raising awareness and using your platform to bring us all together. I'm grateful, as I'm sure all your listeners are.
Thank you once again. And once again, my name is Kevin Boston-Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.